Now, how about Julia? This is a great picture
Yes.
that I like.
Yeah.
How about, we haven't really talked about, we talked a little bit about their marriage date, but can you tell us a little bit more about Julia?
Julia. Yeah, well, Julia Myers actually knew the McCarthy family of Fox Point. Probably sometime after her arrival in 1885 or 6. I think she probably came in 1885. I'll have to refine
Now, would this
that.
be the McCarthys of Catherine McCarthy? That?
Yes,
Right.
they were. First of all, her brother lived over there. Her brother Dennis left West Clifford, 30 West Clifford, and went over to 59 Hope Street.
Right.
And then he bought the house that was set back in the rear of his house. Bought the house next door, and bought 1 or 2 houses on East Avenue in the back. He accumulated a little real estate, and he died around when he was about 50 years old. He died, and it was an unfortunate death. I think one of our cousins mentioned that he was watching a building being torn down, and somehow or other there had been an excavation around the building that was being torn down, and he sort of slid into the ditch at the time, and apparently they weren't able to retrieve him in time. But he had a rather untimely death. But he too was entrepreneurial, and he was a businessman, and seemed to succeed in all his endeavors.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Julia, but she technically was born in Ireland.
Yes, she was born in
She was an
Cologne.
O'Connor.
An O'Connor,
Right.
that's correct. And her father would be Timothy O'Connor, and then her mother would have been Honora. Tian O'Connor. Her maiden name was Tian. That's correct. And she was born in 1864 over in Ireland, and then came here at the age of 22, 23, so that would have been 86 or 87. And I believe she met my grandfather in 88.
Right.
And again, it was through the McCarthys, because she was very closely affiliated with the McCarthy family. And one of the McCarthys, a cousin of my grandfather, married a Rafferty, and she had 10, 11, or 12 children, a very big family. And the youngest was Bernadette. And Bernadette was born in 1888. And my grandfather was invited over to the christening in St. Joseph's Church. And they also had their friend Julia O'Connor over there.
Now, we have the marriage certificate of, where were they married?
Timothy and Julia were married in St. Joseph's Church on Hope Street, and that would have been June 12th. 1889 is when they were married. So she met Timothy Myers in 1888. And it would be very easy to determine, because the baptismal certificate and birth certificate of Bernadette Rafferty is recorded in the Providence Vital Records, you know. So you could almost pinpoint exactly when they met and then exactly when they married.
Wow.
And it was always interesting that the McCarthys were always involved in their weddings, because when John Myers married Catherine McCarthy, there was a McCarthy who was in the wedding party.
Right.
And then when Timothy Myers married Julia O'Connor, there was a McCarthy.
Oh, yeah.
Dennis McCarthy.
Dennis McCarthy.
And an Alice
McCarthy.
Alice McCarthy.
Wow.
They're all connected.
Yeah,
yes.
very connected.
And my grandmother remained in very close contact with these McCarthys.
Wow.
after she married, they were her friends.
Yeah. What can you tell us about, because we kind of talked a little bit about Timothy Myers's kind of foray into politics, but as I understand it, kind of Julia was a little bit, got involved and was
very
successful.
much so. And it seems to me, well, of course, he died in 1915, but in 1916 and 17, she was helping candidates, but nevertheless, she wasn't really able to vote.
Right.
So that tempered the female vote. They weren't able to vote in the United States. And it wasn't until 1920 that women could vote. My father told me that his mother got elected to the school committee in 1922. Wow. And I went to look that up, and I found out that she beat a man by the name of Bill Pimble. Yeah, and he boarded in a house on Algonquin Street, and I talked to him whenever I saw him on the street, or he boarded with a Mrs. Beechnow, had boarders in her house, and he boarded with her. And my mother was a friend of Mrs. Beechnow, and when I would go down to that house, I used to see Mr. Pimble and say hello to him. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that he was the Pimble who was on the school committee, the Republican member, and she prevailed over him in 1922. And I was somewhat.
When did you run into
stunned. When I was very young.
No,
it would have been 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all around that area.
Oh, okay, yeah.
All after we moved to Algonquin Street, 69 Algonquin Street.
Right.
That's right.
Now, how was she? What was the stories on her
Well,
as a grandmother? And
she was just a wonderful person and a good mother, and the children really loved her, and she stuck by the children, and she was, you might say, a relatively young widow at the time, and but there was always a great admiration for her because she was a go-getter, and they used to seek her opinion out on anything that would be political, And I remembered when my Aunt Catherine went to the schools. She was, I believe, she was on the school committee when my Aunt Catherine was in the schools, but also her other daughter, Eleanor, was also in the Providence schools, And when she went on the school committee, Isaac Winslow was the superintendent of schools, and he was superintendent for possibly 25 or 30 years, and he came down from a place, I believe it was Waterville, Maine, came down to Providence and was superintendent of schools. But at that time, when some of the young women in Providence, and our aunts were among them, trying to get an appointment in Providence, it was very, very difficult. But my father said what happened, that many of those that couldn't get an appointment took an appointment out in Gloucester or Burrillville, Woonsocket, and different places out into the country. And my Uncle John was writing articles in the newspaper, and many of those in Providence couldn't go out there, and they were trying to get an appointment in Providence. And what happened was when a vacancy came up, or a number of vacancies came up, they hired these people who were somewhat experienced teachers.
Right.
And it seems as though they always had the jump on the ones that weren't able to take the job out of town.
Right.
And my Uncle John wrote an article sometime around 1914, 15, or 16 in the Providence Tribune, and he said, let's take a look at the activities of Galloping Ike from Waterville, Maine, who came down here. And he spoke about the teachers that were being hired, and he said, it would certainly appear as if they're being guided to do that so that they would get a jump on somebody who was trying to get into the system. They would get a Providence position in the schools.
Right.
And then, of course, my grandmother wasn't elected to the school committee until after her son
Right.
had died in 1919.
Now, would that be,
Unfortunately.
who was the uncle who wrote the article?
John Myers.
John Myers. So
He was
this
a
is John
newspaper
Henry.
reporter. No,
Oh,
there
no.
was John Myers right here,
Oh, okay.
born in 1890.
All right. So one of their children,
The oldest,
the oldest
who was
boy.
a newspaper reporter.
Okay.
See? And he wrote the article on Galloping Ike. Well, when my grandmother got elected to the school committee in 1922, 3 years later, of course, unfortunately, John lost his life through World War I.
Oh.
But he did get home alone, but he was a hospital case when he got home. And at any rate, when my grandmother got onto the school committee, one of the first things when he saw her, he said, "Are you related to the reporter that was on the Providence Tribune?" And she said, "That's absolutely right." And he said, "Oh, I see." And she said, "Did you suspect that from my name?" Well, he said he used to write articles in the newspaper about the Providence schools and the way teachers were hired. And she said, "I think I know what you mean."
Yeah. Wow.
That was kind of
Yeah.
a single event
Yeah.
because he
He was a writer at a very young age then, huh?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, but he went to night school,
Yeah.
and he was always working. But my Aunt Julia said his first concern was for the family, and that that enveloped his life because his father died in 1915.
Now this was a good picture here, just so I can kind of eyeball what John would have looked like.
Yeah.
We've got this picture, but so this would have been John here at the top.
This is a family picture in the living room at 745 Potters Avenue.
Wow, so
That's where it's taken. And what I wouldn't do to find out who were these people.
I was wondering the same thing. Who is this picture of?
Yes, right.
Wow. I was thinking the same.
Was it
exact
of
thing.
my grandfather's mother?
Mother,
I
yeah.
don't know. See,
Yeah.
I don't know. But my father is in here. And at this point, one of their children had died because it would have been Timothy, who was died at 5 years old of an epidemic.